Today's episode is brought to you by S&P Global Market Intelligence. Find insight at every data point with enhanced S&P Capital IQ Pro platform. It's the leading data solution for strategics and investors alike. Discover critical data sets, including coverage of over 54 million global private companies, plus AI-powered tools to streamline your workflow. It's no wonder 85% of companies in the S&P 100 are clients. Learn more at spglobal.com/proinsights. That's spglobal.com/proinsights. Want to see how AI is shaking up the M&A game? Well, you're in luck. Join the Deal Room team on November 7th for our all-demo, no-pitch webinar. We're diving straight into how Deal Room AI is changing the way we tackle due diligence. This isn't your typical webinar. No slides, no fluff, just 30 minutes of live demo. You'll see how AI can extract key info from documents, speed up reviews, cut legal costs, and boost efficiency. Want in? Check the show notes to register or go to the events page on dealroom.net to sign up. Here's to the deal. Hello, M&A scientists. Welcome to the M&A Science Podcast, where we learn from the best in M&A to uncover proven techniques for enterprise value creation. If you're interested in learning more about how to optimize your M&A practice or want to get involved with our community of forward-thinking M&A practitioners, visit mascience.com. Get started by subscribing to our free weekly newsletter. And if you want to keep up with us on the go, head to LinkedIn and follow M&A Science. I'm your host, Kison Patel, CEO and founder of M&A Science. Joining me today is Davis Thacker, Senior Director, Strategy and Business Operations at Carta. Is that the right title?
Yeah, it's a mouthful, but for all intents and purposes, I'm Henry's chief of staff now, and then I also run Corp Dev here, so I'm the head of Corp Dev, but have strategy and biz ops in the title because that's where Corp Dev rolls up into these days.
Awesome. Thanks for helping me with that in the intro.
Yeah, no worries.
Also about Carta, they develop software that helps companies maintain their capitalization tables. It shows the company's percentage of ownership, equity dilution, the value of equity in each round of investment by founders, investors, and owners. Today, we're going to talk about all things executing M&A, domestically, internationally. Hey, just before you start off this interview, I do want to put a disclaimer, not a legal one, but we are Carta customers. I don't want this to be a big thing that we're advocating for them, but we do actually love their product. It's one of the things that's enabled us to create an equity structure for all of our employees, even as a bootstrap company. So that's been pretty meaningful, especially for a team of 50 people, to be able to get access to things, and it's really enabled through platforms like Carta. But that's not too big of a commercial pitch there, but it's, just want to get that out there. Let's talk M&A. Davis, thanks for taking the time to have this conversation here live in San Francisco in your headquarters. I just got done with the interview with Henry, CEO of Carta, and he gave me a good glimpse in the strategy and rationale for the deals you've done and took a lot of credit for doing everything and making them all successful. But I hear you're the one that actually gets things done.
I try to. I hate following up Henry because I'm sure he's going to be a lot more of an interesting conversation and a much better interviewer than I am. But happy to tell you about the kind of nuts and bolts of how we get M&A done here.
Can we kick things off a little bit about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been at Carta for about 5 years now, always an M&A focus. I've led 7 out of our 9 acquisitions that we've done in total here at Carta. Prior to this, I was a growth equity investor at a fund called Adams Street Partners. Most people know them as a big institutional LP. I was on the growth equity team there doing kind of Series B to D deals. Before that, started my career in investment banking. Came across Carta. I actually looked at the Series D when Henry was going around and kind of shopping that. Came across the company, thought it was fantastic. Then Carta had a wonderfully ambiguous title of strategy manager open. And I said, this is perfect. I'm coming out of venture. I don't have any marketable skills for operating within a company. And so something ambiguous like strategy manager was perfect. Came here, led a couple of deals to start. And then as we started to get more acquisitive, we started to kind of like build and round out the corp dev function a little bit more.
That's like a cool roundabout background. The Adam Street struck me because I had an office that was right down the street from there.
Oh, really?
It was the funniest thing because I got the opportunity to meet Bon French.
Yeah.
Here in San Francisco, where I was at this venture capital group, and I just saw Bon French, and I know a handful of people because our office is right there. So I'm like, "Hey, Bon," and it was just a funny thing. Great firm, great culture. How you sort of moved into this role and really built in-house as opposed to just coming from the pure banking. What was that like? What was that like for you? Like, what was sort of the easy and hard part of transitioning from more of the investment side to really like executing M&A?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing in general is, everything that you kind of do on the back end of a deal, right? When you're investing, you're primarily like kind of looking at larger market opportunities. You're looking at the team that's going to go execute it. With M&A internally, you are obviously taking a much deeper lens and a much more nuanced lens in terms of how is this going to work within the company. The personality aspect of it is so important to cultural perspectives, and then just figuring out all the kind of nuts and bolts of integration as well, and then obviously being more involved in kind of nuanced in deal structuring as well. A lot of the growth equity deals that we were doing were, still pretty like vanilla, 1x pref stack deals, things like that. But now getting into more kind of like the nuance of M&A, reps and warranties, all that fun stuff was stuff I hadn't really had a ton of exposure to since kind of like my banking days. But now, in M&A, that's kind of your bread and butter, right? So I would say the biggest change for me was figuring out kind of like the more practical and operational piece of M&A, and then doing the more kind of like nuanced deal structuring that we hadn't really done at Adam Street during growth equity rounds. That's
pretty interesting. It's like you sort of grew your professional experience like with the company building the M&A muscle.
I'm very lucky from that standpoint, and I think a lot of that's the benefit I always tell people of kind of going to a growing, scaling company, right? Like I got great advice coming out of Adam Street from one of my partners there when I was trying to figure out what to do. Honestly, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to do corp dev because I was like, hey, I'm not sure whether I want to just be like kind of like an internal banker at a company. Like I want a little bit more operational experience. And his advice to me was like, go to a great company, scope out a role for yourself, and just try to be the best that you can within that particular role. And that's exactly what I've done here. And I've been very fortunate to work with some amazing people at Carta, Henry being kind of at the top of that list, who have, not only trained me, but kind of given me the scope and exposure to kind of like build my career here. And that's been the great thing. As the company's grown, I've got to kind of like build not only our M&A practice, but kind of my own M&A knowledge as well. And you just do that through kind of learning, through repetition, through working with a lot of great people, a lot of great partners that we've had across the past year, whether that's board members, lawyers, just kind of friends who have kind of helped me out along the way. So been very lucky from that perspective.
So I want to pick your brain on a few different things related to executing deals and also the international cases you've worked on. But before that, one of the big concepts that Henry socialized with me was the concept of doing bounded versus unbounded deals.
Yeah.
And bounded's like very tied to the strategy, pretty clear. Unbounded isn't in the strategy, but then you start rationalizing it and shaping your strategy. But he gave you a lot of credit for a lot of the unbounded ideas. In fact, he would say you understood the assignment when it came to bringing those ideas to the table. Can you talk me through? What do you do to do that?
Well, I mean, I think it's looking at, Carta's one of the things that attracted me about Carta was the fact that it's such an interesting kind of complex network business, right? And I think when you look at larger unbounded opportunities for us, they're largely born out of the fact that we have a really nuanced and really unique kind of network advantage, right? This network of companies, founders, employees, GPs, LPs, everyone that kind of like lives on the Carta platform and uses it in some capacity, like I mean, it probably touches everyone in Silicon Valley in some capacity, one way or another, right? So there are really unique and interesting opportunities that are kind of born out of that. And so I think in order to kind of like bring those opportunities to the table, one, you have to understand our business. And then two, you have to understand kind of all the other businesses out there and try to marry those two things together in terms of figuring out like, where is there really like 1 + 1 = 5 or 1 + 1 = 10 opportunities, right? And I think where we've done a good job is at least bringing those ideas to the table. We need to execute on a couple of like larger unbounded opportunities, but I think we've had good discussions in the past that have kind of made us smarter as a business and really made us think about like, hey, where are there larger TAMs for us to go after? Where are there larger opportunities for us to pursue? And then more importantly, like, what are those large opportunities that we think we have a unique perspective on or a unique right to win because of our network, because of our product, because of our distribution?
Can you make this practical for me? Like, am I trying to take this market map I create and expand that to sort of start, or am I putting a random combination of words with my company name or industry and seeing what comes out?
Yeah, I mean, it's you have to do it one from talking to customers. Two, you kind of have to learn it, or you just have to do it from kind of like understanding the industry and seeing where there are kind of unique product points that you think that you could fit together, right? I mean, Henry's done a really good job of this in the past. Like he describes, 3 different types of network effects that live within Carta, right? There's a relational network effect that's born out of just basically mapping the relationship between two constituents, right? If you're a founder and an investor, that relationship is mapped through our cap table, right? That's a relational network product. Then we have data network products, right? Like our compensation tool. Because we have so many people that are using the cap table product, we're able to bear out better data insights on what you should pay people from a equity perspective because of all the data that we track. And then the final is the liquidity piece, right? Like how can you actually start facilitating transactions on platform because you have everyone together? So if you kind of like look at your business within those kind of like 3 lenses, there's a lot of really interesting things that you can start to think about when you start putting together these combinations in your head, right? So I think that's where, frankly, where Henry has been most helpful for me. It's very nice of him to say that I've done a good job of bringing ideas to the table, but he does a really good job of kind of like mapping out the frameworks and telling you like, here's how to think about like where we could go from here and what's interesting and core to our business. Now go kind of like brainstorm or find those opportunities for us.
That's some homework to do.
Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned the customers too, where it's like you have these conversations. Do you think that's like the main source for it?
Totally. You have to, I mean, listen, a lot of people bring us deals, which is really nice, right? We have a great board of directors that is, constantly feeding us like, hey, have you looked at this company? Have you thought about this company? Like we try to engage them as much as possible on M&A, and they've been super helpful in kind of bringing ideas to the table and frankly, brainstorming things with us as well. But you have to talk to customers first. And that's normally where a lot of our ideas come from is frankly, a customer is talking to either, a salesperson, a product person, an engineering person, customer success, right? It's like, hey, do you guys integrate with this piece of software? Have you guys come across this in the past? Like oftentimes, like, part of my job on corp dev is just having a good kind of like pulse with the business in terms of like, what are they hearing from our customers in terms of what we could be doing, competitors that we're potentially losing business to, or even places that we should be integrating, right? And oftentimes like places you should be integrating with are really natural feeders in terms of like what your corp dev strategy should be.
So the natural course of discovering bounded opportunities, you'll find unbounded things.
Yeah.
And then, your board is proactive. Do you have to activate them or do they naturally bring this stuff up to you?
I think you have to like activate them at the start and then they naturally bring stuff up to you. Like part of that is like being very transparent with the board in terms of like, what are your priorities and what are the things that you're looking at, right? Because, there might be a time where like, you're bringing immediate opportunities to your board, but they don't necessarily have an idea of like, okay, this is something that we're evaluating from a pure kind of like speculative perspective, right? Like, hey, we're just looking at this industry. We don't know whether we're going to invest in it. But if you bring them along that journey, then they're much better partners in terms of bringing deals to you, saying like, oh, we actually looked at this company, X, Y, and Z. So we found that like the more transparent, like the more brainstorming you are with them, like the more value that we're able to get out of the board.
Bankers bring you deals?
They do. So we work with bankers, frankly, kind of given the sizing of a lot of deals that we've gone after in the past, that hasn't been like a huge channel for us. But as we continue to kind of like move up and start doing larger and larger deals, I imagine that'll become more of a channel for us in the future.
Yeah. Once you go public, they'll all call you.
Yeah, exactly.
All at the same time.
I hope you do.
I was going to say, you probably get a lot of unbounded opportunities from the banks.
Yeah.
What about like tools? Like in terms of your core team, are you doing your own research? Are you using special tools that give you leads?
Yeah, I mean, we not necessarily for leads. I mean, we have a great CRM. We use Affinity for mapping kind of like all of our deals and relationships and things like that. And frankly, that's been fantastic in terms of like getting the executives on Affinity and mapping kind of like who has relationships where, and even with the board as well. So that's been a great tool for us in terms of just kind of mapping out our network and being able to track our different. And being able to track kind of different prospects. In terms of discovery, frankly, a lot of it's just still done on pitch book, still done on research, and then again, I'm like really talking to our customers and really talking to kind of internal teams in terms of like what are they seeing on the ground in terms of what customers are telling them. So, unfortunately, no kind of like special tools there.
No shortcuts.
No
AI
shortcuts.
One day will solve all this.
I hope so. Yeah.
Tell me what we should buy this year.
Yeah.
Davis, let's talk about execution.
Yeah.
What's your philosophy? Tell me, like, let's break it down. What? Because you guys done a good number of deals, and you sort of touched on the spectrum of strategy from the acqui-hires to the product. What is the term that Henry used? It's like product tuck-ins.
Tuck-ins, yeah.
So, yeah, product tuck-ins. And then you've done stuff to expand market share, the book of business plays, and international. What have you learned?
We've learned a lot. I mean, we've done 9 deals at this point, and I feel like we learned something new on every single one. I mean, I could go in a number of different directions here. I think the number one thing that I've learned over the past couple of years is just you have to change your M&A strategy or change your M&A spectrum and appetite based on kind of like where the business is, right? The types of deals that we are interested in that we look at today, now that we're a $400 million business, is drastically different than when I joined the company and we were, around a $50 million business, or even when we were a $100 million business, right? The overall kind of the spectrum and the magnitude that you have to think about with M&A just it expands dramatically. You can't be looking at kind of a bunch of kind of like $5 or $10 million deals anymore. You have to actually start looking at larger businesses that are going to be future $100 million businesses for you in the future. So you have to start thinking more on that unbounded scale. That's not necessarily saying that you don't look at smaller deals, right? I actually think where we're going today is a little bit more of a barbell strategy, right? Where you have smaller deals that you can integrate really quickly, or you have larger deals that warrant a larger integration effort. I think, where we've gotten, I think where M&A struggles a little bit, and particularly where integration struggles a little bit, is you have these kind of like messy middle deals, right? Where they're like just big enough where they actually require a pretty decent integration lift, but they still pale in comparison into the overall revenue profile of the company. And so it's really hard to kind of like force a prioritization conversation from there. So I think that's where you have to be really crystal clear in terms of what's the strategy from what's going to be the strategy for the deal, what's the integration lift from the internal teams, and does that make sense with their overall prioritization, right? Are they going to actually be able to make the time for these deals? And so I think that's really been the biggest learning, which sounds obvious, but it's definitely been, I think it's only something you can really learn just by doing a number of deals.
Yeah, I can see that shifting depending on the company.
Totally.
What types of deals that make the most sense for you to do. Integration reports up to you.
It does, yeah.
That's the interesting thing over the years of doing these podcasts, where just integration is the biggest thing that's probably growing in concern and emphasis overall, all the way up to the board level. And you even hear it in just earning calls, where there's a lot more questions about, are you actually going to integrate this thing?
Totally.
So what's your learnings on that approach of integrating companies and making that part successful?
Yeah, there's been a big learning there. I think the biggest thing is just really driving accountability from across the business, right? And so while integration does technically roll up through corp dev, it really is a cross-functional effort across the entire company, and it's usually something that strategy and biz ops leads. That's part of the reason why corp dev rolls up through strategy and biz ops here, is that the biz ops team and strategy team does a really good job in terms of being really in tune with kind of the day-to-day overall pulse of the business. And I think they're oftentimes best positioned to be able to fully integrate a company and figure out like what's the strategy for integrating the company, who from the business should be involved. And so we rely on them like very significantly. Like oftentimes they're the ones that are actually kind of like really leading the day-to-day of the integration, while corp dev is still responsible for kind of overall success of the integration, right? Because at the end of the day, I think you still do want to have like the people who are leading the deals be responsible and accountable for success. You kind of need that full end-to-end spectrum to create accountability and consistency. But you also need the people who are living in the business a little bit more to actually, drive that forward.
I'm trying to think of like this whole, it's like the structure of it. Cause you have corp dev, you do have like a designated integration leader, or is it just because you mentioned it's part of this, the operations group?
Yeah. We actually don't have a fully dedicated integration person today. It's a role that we've explored kind of bringing on in the past. I think, if we were doing kind of more frequent deals, we haven't done a deal in around, year, 18 months or so, but it's something that I think as we jumpstart our M&A motion a little bit again, I think it's something that we'll look to bring on. In the past, we found that it's often been really good to kind of like house within strategy and biz ops, just because again, they're a little bit more in tune in terms of the day-to-day of the business.
It's interesting when you have these conversations with different M&A teams, and there's like a maturity cycle of how you build the M&A function. But then I think there's also the volume of deals. And that's what I'm trying to get at is I notice over time, it really shifts from a seller-led M&A process to a buyer-led M&A process.
Yep.
And especially if you're doing concurrent transactions, you have no choice but to do a buyer-led process.
Yeah.
You've got more people on your side working on the deal. You need to have that consistency. You want to have control of how you plan and execute integration.
Totally.
What have you seen from that perspective of like going from seller-led to buyer-led over the deals that you've done, even though you're not necessarily doing concurrent transactions now, but just even doing them, I guess technically it's still occasional, right? The 0 to 1 year, occasional acquirer. How have you seen that evolve, even just as an occasional acquirer?
So I think I think the biggest thing that you learn is you need consistency across deals in terms of your integration strategy, even in terms of kind of like your deal structuring strategy, right? Like how are you treating employees that are coming into the company? How are you thinking about retention? How are you thinking about reps and warranties? Because if you're doing, if you're at a period where you're doing, I think we did in 2021 to 2022, we did around 4 or 5 deals. If you're doing 4 or 5 deals and all of them have kind of like a crazy number of different terms, it becomes really difficult to track internally. And it becomes a huge lift for the kind of like more platform teams internally, whether it's people, HR, legal, finance, to basically being able to track that across the entire company. So I think that's where regardless of whether you're doing concurrent deals or not, if you want to be doing efficient M&A, and especially if you want to be doing concurrent deals, you kind of have to have your playbook in place and you have to stick to it. And I think that's what we've learned over the past couple of years, and that's what we've started to implement, like just more of a consistent process, whether it's structuring, integration, you name it. And I think the biggest thing too is the biggest thing I've learned over the past probably 5 years or so is bring integration in as early into the process as you can, and just like have someone there that at least has a pulse on knowing what the potential pitfalls are going to be during integration while you're structuring the deal, while you're thinking about the thesis. Like bring them along as early as you possibly can.
When you get an LOI signed, where are you at in terms of the integration thinking planning?
Yeah. So typically right now, I'm bringing in integration pre-LOI. And so we have an initial perspective on integration before we sign an LOI. Typically, like how we think about things, I don't think we've ever had an LOI that hasn't resulted in kind of a completed deal. And so when we sign a term sheet, we essentially know that we want to kind of like move forward with that deal, right? So traditionally, we want to have like a more fulsome integration plan in place. So we typically front load a lot of our diligence. You're not able to do that in every deal, right? If it's more of a banked process, you might have, a 2-stage process where we submit an LOI not knowing whether it's going to get signed or not. But in a more buyer-led process where we control it a little bit more, if we're signing an LOI with a company and we know we're getting into exclusivity, we have every intention of kind of closing from there.
How has that evolved over time? Like were the early deals, you weren't doing that?
So I'd say the earlier deals, we had kind of like a high level strategy in place, but we hadn't really one, scoped out kind of like a proper integration function. And then 2, had kind of like more of a specific playbook of integration. And that was something that we learned probably like in deal 1 or deal 2 that we did here. Right. And so I think after we did those 2, it was more of like, okay, how do we actually like put more of a robust process in place where, when we're going into an LOI, we have a specific integration plan in place. We're doing integration readouts where every team is kind of coming in presenting on here's the plan 30, 60, 90 days, even a year afterwards, right? Here are the metrics that we're going to be tracking against. Here's what we're going to do to make this successful. Here's what we need to do to kind of like bolster the acquisition, just bringing a lot more kind of like process and rigor around it.
This buyer-led M&A, you're really bringing all this integration up front.
Totally. That's been the biggest learning for us. That, and then, right sizing deals with the strategy have been kind of like the two biggest things that we've learned over the past 5 years or so.
I wanted to ask you about working with your CEO on deals. What's the good and bad?
The good is that working with your CEO is probably your best closer on M&A, right? And especially if it's a founder-to-founder-led deal. And I think that's where Henry is most helpful, is when we're trying to acquire other founders, right? Because Henry's a founder CEO himself. He brings a lot of empathy and thoughtfulness sitting on the other side. And so he's our best closer. What the biggest learning that I've had in terms of working with Henry is when to deploy him. And I think you need to deploy your CEO very early on in the process and very late on in the process. The middle is where you actually want corp dev and the deal team to kind of own more of the process, right? Because I think, part of the strategy is having your CEO being able to like come in and be a little bit more friendly and being a little bit more having a friendlier relationship with the other founder, right? Like, I don't want Henry negotiating reps and warranties with the founder, right? That's like not a position that, one, is like a good use of Henry's time, or two, creates like a good experience with the other founder, right? So leave that to the deal team. And so I try to involve Henry up at front when they're talking about kind of like strategy. What does it make, or how does it make sense to kind of like put these two companies together? What does their working relationship look like? And then at the very end, like, hey, if there are one or two like really key items that we need to nail out with the other founder, that's where we can kind of have Henry come in, close, make the ultimate judgment call.
That makes a lot of sense. At the beginning and the end, those two spots, right? First impression and let's get the deal done.
Exactly.
And then it sounds like there's a good rationale why you want to keep them out of the middle, because you want in the nuts and bolts and be a little bit too hands-on. Where
totally, and it's also not a good use of his time either, right? Like that's what the corp dev team is here for. If he wanted to negotiate every rep and warranty, then I wouldn't have a job here.
What would be like your advice to other corp dev folks, people in your role, in terms of working collaboratively with the CEO? Like, what's the key things you really want to be on top of? How do you really make that relationship work well?
Yeah, I mean, it's entirely dependent on the CEO, right? I think with Henry, the things that he really cares about and that he really enjoys working with corp dev is, one, he wants to talk to interesting companies. So I always try to put a couple of companies on his radar, like every quarter, every month, and just try to schedule good meetings for him, right, where he can kind of learn other industries and learn other businesses that exist either very much outside or adjacent to Carta. And that just like, whether we're going to acquire those businesses or not, like just expanding his aperture and expanding his learning, like that's what he uses corp dev for, right? I think that's step one. In terms of pitfalls that I really try to avoid, or things I really try to be cognizant of, is, again, it's the founder CEO mindshare. And so I think one of the things that Henry has always told me that he really cares about is the founders have to have a good experience when they're going through Carta M&A. He's like, whether it's through fundraising, whether it's working through potential partners, like I think a lot of founder CEOs have had bad experience with corp dev teams or with investors, or you name it, basically running deals with folks, right? And so I think always having a good kind of like founder NPS going through M&A, always being transparent, always like being cognizant of like whether we're wasting people's time, if it's not going to be a realistic deal, just kind of like calling it like it is, always being honest and kind of like thoughtful about things. Like that's something that Henry really cares about. And so that's an advice that I would give to other people, especially if you're working for a founder CEO. Having a high founder NPS on the other side of the deal, I think, is really important.
So keep a healthy pipeline.
Yeah.
Get the CEO in front of other CEOs. And then if you're pushing a deal forward, create a good people experience for that CEO, founder.
Regardless of whether the deal goes through or not, right? I mean, obviously, you especially want the deal or the founder experience to be positive if a deal goes through. But even if a deal doesn't go through, you still want people saying, hey, at least like they acted with integrity. They were honest about their intentions, and I still had a good experience going through there. Most deals aren't going to go through, right? But you still want founders on the other side. Our business is dealing with founders, right? So and working with founders. So we have to put that at kind of like at the forefront of all of our interactions with folks.
International deals.
Yeah.
I was told that you know how to do them.
Late nights and early mornings is usually step one and step two of those. So yeah, we've done. We've had the pleasure of doing 2 deals in the UK at this point. We've done 1 in Canada, 1 in Australia, and 1 in India. So we've kind of been all over the place, and obviously we've looked at a number of deals outside of there. So it's definitely been a learning experience across the board. What can I tell you about it?
Did you pick up any interesting cultural stereotypes?
No interesting cultural stereotypes, but it is interesting in terms of just like generally how companies will kind of do M&A there. Even just like learning the different kind of like provider ecosystem, like finding like a good M&A law firm counterpart in Australia or finding it in India. Like so much of that is helps facilitate a good deal experience that we've had a lot of learnings kind of like on the ground there.
I'm going to have a drink with you to get the cultural stereotypes out. I get it. Next time I'm in town,
we'll do it. I promise.
When it comes to executing international, and it's just like, what were these like big lessons learned from, and especially just thinking first deal, second deal, third deal, I guess what are like the fundamental deals of doing deals internationally, the challenges that surprise you?
Yeah.
And then how does it get nuanced country by country?
Yeah. So I think, broad strokes doing international deals, I think the biggest thing is figuring out what the operating cadence looks like with the companies, right? Like, are you going to leave them a little bit more standalone? Do they function as more of like a GM model? Like figuring out the org structure and figuring out like the operating cadence with the mothership is really important. Then figuring out kind of like cross-pollination with kind of like the internal Carta teams has been really helpful for us as well. Like what we've done or what we did, I think successfully with the couple of UK acquisitions is we had a couple of their people, everyone's under the same roof now, but a couple of the folks from the acquired teams come work in the US offices, whether that's San Francisco or New York. And then we actually sent a good number of our kind of US people out there to basically do stints in London, right? And that's kind of like to bring a little bit more kind of like Carta best practices, bring a little bit more Carta culture, and start to do a little bit more of that cross-pollination so that they don't, feel like they're literally and figuratively on an island, right? And so I think that's been like from a cultural perspective, really important for us is figuring out those operating cadences, figuring out those operating models, figuring out, okay, do we have an exec that's going out like once a quarter at least or once a month to go visit the teams there? Like, are we making sure that we're showing up for basically the teams that we acquired there? It's a big time commitment, right? And it's a big organizational commitment to kind of live and breathe in a different geography. And so I think it's really just aligning all the executives in terms of saying, hey, this is going to be not something that you just do during the deal. This is going to be something that you have to live and breathe and learn. And we have to commit to sending people out there. We have to commit to doing specific product requirements for, international geographies. Like that's just part of the pain and the opportunity of becoming a really global company. But we think that if we're able to do this successfully, like doing this is hard and it's spawned a lot of really fantastic businesses. I think deal is probably the paramount there of someone who's, really been able to learn these kind of like international nuances and create a really massive business on top of it. And we think we have an equally sizable opportunity to do so.
People experience is your big focus.
Yeah.
The tax, the other stuff, you kind of leave that to the experts.
Yeah, definitely leave that to the experts. We have a fantastic finance and legal team who, work with a lot of our partners down there to figure out from an operational perspective, what will it take to kind of like set things up there. I think there are some geographies that are easier to do this in than others. I think UK, for example, is a lot easier to do this in than India, right? I think, India brings a lot of challenges from a kind of like local regulatory perspective in terms of just, compliance, tax, things like that. I think that we definitely underestimated the amount of kind of legwork it would take to kind of like build out a presence there. Whereas the UK, we've been able to do that pretty efficiently and pretty effectively.
All right. So I want to go back to people experience. Let's click into that, but let's step back international and get national first.
Okay.
I want to get a sense of what does that mean to create a good people experience. And I think it's interesting what I picked up on is it starts with just the CEO of the company.
Yeah.
You emphasize it. So maybe we can start there of like, what are you doing early in the deal process to create a good people experience for the incoming CEO and executives? And then how does that continue and expands?
Yeah, I think it's so how you structure kind of like the people engagement is probably a little bit dependent on the size of the company, right? And that's what we've learned, and I think it's something that we'll have to continue tweaking with, especially as we potentially look at acquiring larger companies. I think what's worked well for us in the past is, again, forming that strong CEO to CEO relationship. I think that's definitely paramount. And then, if Henry isn't going to sponsor the deal, if it's going to be, our chief product officer or our chief strategy officer that's going to sponsor the deal internally, making sure that you have strong, sponsor to CEO relationships as well. So I think we've done that across the board, pretty well here. And then, as the deal progresses, obviously more leaders from their side are going to get looped into the deal, right? So the broader executive team will get looped in. And that's where, then it's upon us to like really kind of like bring the full force of Carta and make sure that we're forming relationships across all those individual touch points, that our go-to-market people are forming good relationships with their go-to-market execs, and like really making sure that we have strong relationships across their entire organization. And once we feel like we've done a good job of that across the executive team, then it's typically how we've done this in the past is once we've gone into exclusivity and we become close to signing a deal, then it's really about like getting the whole team at the acquired company excited about joining Carta. And so that's where, Henry will typically fly out, give like a full strategy presentation on like, here's who Carta is, give them like a full look into our financials. Like, here's how the business is performing. Here's why we're excited about our business. Here's why we're excited about the prospect of our two businesses joining together. Here's what it looks like. Actually, fully explaining the integration thesis to them as well, in terms of like, here's where you guys will sit in an org. Here's here's how we're going to be measuring success for you guys. Like, I think a lot of times when you're an acquired company, you just don't know, hey, like, how do I fit into this broader organization? Like, what does this mean for my job? What does this mean for my team? What does this mean for our product? Trying to answer as many of those questions up front as possible is something that we've tried to do.
This is during confirmatory diligence.
We usually try to get it as close to the end of confirmatory due diligence as possible, but there have been some situations where we've actually done this before closing the deal.
Okay.
But it's usually for smaller companies, right? Like there's no way that we would do this for like 100-person plus company. If it's a smaller company and the team is a little bit more, tight knit, I think it's typically been incumbent on the acquired founders to feel like, hey, we want to expose more of our team to this. So it's typically at the point where like, hey, we've basically signed the deal. We're about to close. Let's loop the broader team in. Let's make them feel like, hey, this is going to close. You guys should be excited about this for X, Y, and Z reasons.
Right. So I'm looking at my notes. The magic is transparency.
Yeah.
I'm very transparent.
Yep.
I framed this as reverse diligence.
Yeah.
That you're actually briefing this incoming company
Totally.
on your organization, the integration thesis,
Totally.
everything.
Totally. Yeah, it's been really important for us, and I think the acquired teams appreciate it. Right, it makes them kind of feel like they're a part of Carta even before the deal closes. Right, and again, it's not something that we're going to be able to do with every deal. Especially, I'd imagine for most of the deals that we do during going forward, this will be something that happens kind of immediately post deal close. But the good thing is that I think we have the playbooks in place in terms of like, what does Henry want to talk about, like, what breakouts do we want to be doing? We typically bring like a lot of cultural leaders to the company as well and have people talk about like, what does it mean to work at Carta? Like, what does go-to-market look like at Carta? What does product look like at Carta, right? And really trying to make sure that people feel like they understand the business that they're joining, they understand the company that they're joining, and they're understanding the people that they're going to be working with. I think that's what's really important at the end of the day.
It's exposing them to the culture just as well as part of it.
Yeah.
This seems like a good approach.
Yeah.
Tell me the dirt, man. Tell me the bad. I want to know why this doesn't work and where people lose their shit during these deals.
Yeah. I mean, where people frankly lose their shit. And, I think it always comes down to, do you have the right alignment with the executive team on what, and usually it's the product vision, right? And I think it's trying to balance the vision that the company has as a standalone company versus what is required to create a really strong integration with Carta. That's usually where we see the biggest kind of like friction points with acquired founders is, hey, they have a standalone roadmap that they're excited to kind of go execute against. And in many situations, not all, we're having to pivot that to focus on like, how do we create a really strong integration experience with Carta, right? So that the customer doesn't feel like you're interacting with two different products or two different platforms, you're interacting with one. And so it's how do you kind of like counterbalance the desires of kind of like the standalone acquiree versus the vision and kind of the overall product desires of the acquirer. I think that's always where the biggest friction point is.
Yeah, I could see that. Even though you spent effort early in the deal, where like before you sign it, wouldn't you flushed a good amount of that out?
Totally. I mean, you would think, right? But you know, we've been in situations, and I've talked to other M&A practitioners who do this too. It's like, you know, you can have all the best strategy out there, and you can, you know, say all the right things, but then all of a sudden, when it comes to brass tacks, and a founder has to kind of like not necessarily kill their baby, but pivot their roadmap in a pretty material way. Sometimes that's really difficult to do, right? And you never know for sure. I think we've done a good job of it on the whole, but yeah, I mean, I think there are situations where, you know, he probably could maybe be doing a little bit of extra expectation setting, or the founders don't necessarily fully appreciate, or frankly, we might not even fully appreciate how much of an integration lift there is going to be. So again, that's where it's really important to kind of like do the upfront scoping. But yeah, I think it's usually expectation setting on both sides, and it's like, hey, are we working towards the same thing? Do we want to work towards the same thing? I think that's the biggest thing at the end of the day.
It is. People are the biggest challenges in these deals.
Totally. I mean, people make the companies, right? So you have to have strong alignment across the board.
So now we get back to doing international, and we got a bunch of time zone differences. We've got sometimes language, cultural understanding differences, laws and regulation differences.
Yeah.
And then like what becomes the challenge when it comes to that maintaining that similar people experience? Because it's just, you're operating in a different world. Like what could go wrong?
Yeah. I mean, it's difficult across the board, honestly. I mean, it's not only are you trying to kind of like bring a different cultural standard to the company, or finding the right cultural balance, right? It's like, how much of the acquired company kind of like practices and culture do you want to keep versus like how much do you want to try to, you know, integrate with like the overall Carta culture? That's always kind of like the magic behind these things, right? Is how do you maintain often the velocity and the speed at which smaller teams operate versus, you know, bringing more of like the kind of cultural umbrella of Carta to the company. That's even harder to do in international deals, right? Where Carta might not even have as much of a brand in international markets, where, you know, it's really hard to kind of create a consistent employee experience if we're, you know, don't have people that are, or if you're not kind of like bringing people into the same office, right? So again, that's why it's really important to make sure that you have that cross-pollination, that you have like a strong operating cadence of people that are going out and visiting the offices and like being on the ground with those teams, seeing how they're operating, like, and getting just ultimately a pulse check. Because, you know, the hardest thing is just, you know, if they're left on an island, and you just don't know, you don't have a good sense of kind of how things are operating on the ground there. I think that's it's the visibility piece that I think is the hardest.
Do you send people there? I mean,
we typically do, yeah.
You send people there specifically for that. There's two parts. There's sort of the people that you send out. One, how do you convince somebody to go leave home and go to a whole other country?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, how do you pitch that mission?
You know, sometimes it's easier than, or sometimes it's a little bit easier than other times. You know, we're lucky in that, you know, you're working at a high growth tech company. You have a lot of people who are ambitious and see it as a good career opportunity, right? Like if you're, you know, an employee at kind of like the Carta mothership, right? It's like, hey, I have an opportunity to go work with this acquired company that, you know, we've, you know, spent money on, that we have commitment to, but needs a little bit of kind of like a injection of kind of Carta culture. It's a really good opportunity for someone inside of Carta to kind of like take on maybe a little bit more of a leadership role there, and kind of grow their career a little bit. So we've had good success with sending kind of people that are kind of like mid in their careers, but are really strong kind of like Carta culture carriers, and sending them to those offices. And, you know, doesn't sometimes take a lot to convince people to move to London for a year. You know, it's something I thought about too, to be honest with you. And so, you know, I think there are, you know, lots of really interesting opportunities from that perspective.
Go ahead and try to convince me to go to India for a year.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. My Indian listeners, I love you. Okay. So there's sort of the cross-pollination of actual people, that culture, you get report back out. When you think about culture, the way you described it, you pushed into different elements. Does that come out to be like a matrix that you kind of evaluate? Here's culture, here's what we don't want to change, and here's what we change?
I think we break it down into a couple of different things, right? In terms of just like, hey, like, how is the org, or what's the org structure of the acquired company? What are kind of like reporting and operating cadences? Like, how often are they meeting? How do they like to get work done? Like, are they a Slack culture? Are they a meetings culture? Are they a, Notion documentation culture, right? Like all these different things we try to get a little bit of a pulse on and figure out, okay, how much of this is kind of like critical to kind of like the DNA and operating of the company that we can't change. Like I'll tell you one thing, like one of the companies that we acquired in the UK, like loves documenting everything via Notion. Like they're big Notion users, document everything there, try to limit as many meetings as possible. Whereas Carta is skews a little bit more on like a meeting heavy culture. And so it's like, how do you bridge those two things together? And ultimately we're like, hey, like you guys keep operating the way that you guys need to internally. You guys are going to have probably a couple more meetings on your calendar as you're dealing with kind of like the larger kind of like Carta mothership. But we're going to try to preserve as much of your kind of like core Notion heavy culture as possible.
It's a good way to do it.
Yeah.
More transparency.
Yeah.
The Carta values, like how hard do you push your values when you acquire a company?
What do you mean by push our values?
I feel like it varies. You have some companies where it's more about getting them like operationally integrated.
Yeah.
And then there's others where it's actually more about the culture side of, hey, here's our big values, and we really like sort of push it. And they put like leadership coaching in there, and that really gets all that leadership around these values and redirects or re-evangelizes it. And it's just like that's part of it, or their strategy of sort of bringing is that something that you guys think about, or is it more of like?
I'd say it's usually not something that we necessarily try to push, but it's more of like something that we diligence, right? It's like, hey, do we think that the company and the acquired team kind of overall fit our values, right? And I've seen in our successful deals, like I've seen Henry kind of like go in, walk through the office, and he says, oh, wow, this looks like Carta when we were a Series A or a Series B company, right? And usually that's a pretty good indicator that, hey, there might be a pretty good cultural fit there. If like the founder CEO kind of goes through and says, yeah, I can see them being a good fit. Like that's where it's, frankly, really helpful to have Henry there.
In terms of the strategy of expanding internationally, how do you think through that? Is it, do you map out the world and say, all right, we should like go to the UK?
Yeah. I mean, it really is kind of like a mapping of the world, and part of it's figuring out where venture dollars are going to, right? And so I think you look at where a majority of venture dollars have gone to over the outside of the U.S. and outside of China over the past couple of years. It's really been India, Europe, and Australia that have received kind of the most venture interest. And before doing those acquisitions, we didn't have as much of a presence in either three of those geographies, and so now we do. And so for us, it was just like, how are we creating a global company? And also it's realizing like it's taking a step back and realizing, hey, is the industry that you're in necessitate kind of a global footprint? And we are firm believers that venture, at scale is a global industry and a global business. Like there are great companies that get formed in every country kind of across the world, every major geography. And so we believe that, if we're going to ultimately be kind of the map of where capital goes to and the ultimate capital map in kind of the entire venture ecosystem, we need to be in each of those geographies and have a part in each of those major companies.
Spending a lot of time in international flights?
During those deals, yes. Now that I think we have a little bit more of the operating cadence down, but yeah, I did fly out. I was spending, there was, I think, 1 year where I think I did 2 flights to Australia and 6 to Europe. So it was a busy year.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Brutal.
Yeah, but it was fun.
But even if these are like early deals, like you got good conversations going, and now you want to just do the meet and greet.
It's tough to do. I think I literally did 36 hours in Sydney just to put a little bit of time pressure to sign a term sheet. So my chief strategy officer and I flew out at the time, and we basically said, okay, we're going to do 36 hours. It was on my birthday actually. Flew out there. We said we're going to spend 36 hours there. We're going to try to get them to sign the term sheet, put some pressure on them and basically say like, hey, we're flying out to Australia to do this. And if we leave without a term sheet, like we don't really know where the deal is. And so thankfully we got the deal signed there. But you have to kind of, figure out how to do things like that. And it can sometimes work to your advantage where you're putting a little bit of kind of like artificial time pressure on things just because you have such limited face-to-face time together. So it can kind of work in your advantage from a deal perspective. But yeah, it is. It definitely is a little exhausting.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Any other tips, advice on doing international or sort of moving from domestic to international?
Have great partners on the ground there. It's the biggest thing. Making sure you have good partners on the ground from like a law firm and a tax perspective that can kind of like help you navigate these things. Like that was the biggest thing for us.
I'm going to read on that because it does like fundamentally apply. Like you got to have a good attorney.
Totally.
Period. But internationally, it's different building the relationships.
It is.
It's not, like here, it's pretty easy. I can go ask you for some referrals for an M&A attorney. Boom.
Yeah.
But if you go in a specific segment, if we're going to do a deal Germany, I don't know. So how do you approach finding those partners?
Usually from our counsel in the U.S. And usually they'll have kind of like partner networks because usually part of what can make global M&A a little bit difficult is sometimes you need to use kind of like two sets of counsels. Like, for a lot of our deals, we had to have kind of, our US counsel opine on things, but then we also had kind of like a UK or an Indian counsel that opined on the kind of like the more country specific parts of the deal as well. So you have to figure out kind of like what the division of labor is between the different counsels. But again, that's where it's really helpful to have people that you know and trust on the ground there, and people that are competent and can work well with kind of your network of partners in the US.
Any other big gotchas or things I should know not to do?
No, I think it's really figuring out the cultural and kind of like operating cadence piece of it. That's the hardest piece of it. And I think going into it, you always underestimate like how much not work it's going to be, but how much it kind of does change the DNA of the company, right? Like, hey, you want to do an all hands at 3 or 4 o'clock Pacific? Okay, well then you're shutting out a lot of the world from that perspective, right? So you need to think about like how are you changing the kind of like fabric of your operating cadences, communications as a company to facilitate more of kind of like an international presence.
So there's really a lot more of just looking broadly at operating the company and how that's going to get modified as you bring international team members.
Yeah, it becomes less about like how do you do international M&A, but it's more about like how do you become an international company, global right? Company. Yeah, so I think that's what it really comes down to at the end of the day.
That's our conclusion.
Yeah.
Hey, before we wrap up, I want to ask you about negotiating deals.
Yeah.
Because I talked to Henry about like this bid-ask spread and this market, I got high valuation expectations.
Totally.
So I was kind of like bantering with them. Well, this is what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, like from because you sort of click in, you're running a lot of the execution stuff. Love to hear your thoughts and how do you balance that? And I'm just kind of wondering, like, what are the levers that you're looking at and being able to negotiate that deal?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, right? I mean, we're in a, pretty much a pretty consistently changing valuation environment. I mean, obviously you saw what happened in the stock market yesterday, right? Yeah. So, I mean, valuations can kind of change on a dime, pretty significantly. So I think
one meme could change the whole market.
Yeah, you never know, right? So, I mean, at the end of the day, I think that's one why you have to have like a pretty consistent view on valuation of, or not even valuation, but of kind of like strategy and what you ultimately think that you can do with the company internally, right? Like you need to have a really strong kind of synergies case and kind of like pro forma model in terms of, what you think you're going to be able to do internally with it. And then in terms of kind of like the different tools that you have, I mean, it's really, at the end of the day, it's you have kind of like price, you have consideration mix, you have kind of like founder retention bonuses, like you can play around with so many of these different things. I think at the end of the day, what you really need in order to structure a good deal is you kind of need to know what everyone is solving for. So you need to know kind of like where the founders are at. That's where I utilize Henry in terms of like trying to really get a sense of like, okay, such a emotional, intimate experience for a founder to think about selling their company. Why are they engaging in the conversation? What do they want out of a potential transaction? Like, what are they optimizing for? That's so much more personal and is often something that like Henry does one-on-one with the founder, right? Because it's such an intimate and personal experience. Also, what is the board solving for? So I think that's where, a lot of the deals that we did early on, we didn't necessarily engage the board until the actual transaction. Now for a lot of the like bigger deals that we're trying to do, it's how are you engaging the board kind of like 6 months or a year before a transaction even happens, right? Like knowing, okay, where are they in their fund life cycle? What are they trying to optimize for? Understanding kind of like what are the different perspectives and what are the different incentives kind of like around the table of a deal that you're in really gives you a better insight in terms of, okay, how can I structure a deal that hits the check marks of as many people around the table as possible, or at least the important people around the table, right?
Yeah, so it goes back to like digging into the real underpinning drivers for people, which is different for the different stakeholders.
Yeah,
because the board.
In many cases, you will have competing priorities, and so it's figuring out like, okay, how do you balance those, right?
What's like the variation? I know I talked about the vision for the founder of where he wants to take the company.
Yep.
Which a lot of it's like product distribution, right? Yep. You created an awesome solution. You want to get it activated and get market share.
Yeah.
So like, boom, that's like one big vision. What are like other things that really are these kind of non-pure price-oriented factors you want to get aligned on?
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, that's why, come back to culture, right? I think besides kind of like product distribution from the founder, oftentimes it's like, hey, if I have a 50 or 100 person or even a larger company, it's like, am I putting them in a good, or am I putting my employees in a good home, in a good situation, right? And so I think that's where it's like, as much as we need to understand the culture of the company, it's equally as important for the founder and the executive team of the acquired company to understand kind of like who we are as a company, and also to have like a good brand as a corporate acquirer that, hey, we're going to take care of the company and the people and the product that you built, right? And so again, it comes. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it comes back to transparency. So, what are you doing with the product? What are you doing with the company? What are you doing with the people? Making sure that you're crystal clear, aligned on that, and that they have the trust that you're actually going to go execute on that. That's really important for the founders at the end of the day.
The underlying drivers and then the cultural match.
Yeah.
Where you create that transparency, you really understand if there's a good fit that gets people excited about combining the companies.
Totally.
What's the craziest thing you've seen in M&A?
I've seen international deals. It was actually a deal that we didn't do, but the counterparty was using a law firm that primarily only did dental family law. And you can imagine their surprise when they got a 60-page SPA from our counsel here in the U.S. That was pretty crazy. I've seen crazy deal structures all over the place. I'm trying to think. Nothing else comes immediately to mind. It was funny when I was. That was the first thing that came to mind when you were asking me about like good partners in other ecosystems and other geographies. Like having good counterparty counsel as well is equally important.
This has been an awesome conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you for helping me become a better M&A scientist today. Those of you still listening, fellow M&A scientists, I want to thank you. Love to hear your feedback. Tell me how I can get better at doing this. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. Always open to some ideas, speaker recommendations. Till next time, here's to the deal.